Welcome everybody to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. Our main event tonight is with Jon M Sweeney, the publisher and editor-in-chief of Paraclete Press. His many books include James Martin from the same series as tonight's book, in the People of God series, The Pope Who Quit, which was optioned by HBO, and The Pope's Cat, a popular series for children. He edited a course in Christian Mysticism by Thomas Merton. He writes regularly for America in the US and The Tablet in the UK. His new book, Nicholas Black Elk, we're very honored tonight to have Sweeney in conversation with Damian Costello, who specializes in the intersection of Catholic theology, indigenous spiritual traditions, and colonial history. A big welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. It is a pleasure to be with Boswell Book Company, and you are such a central part of my life and the life of many of us in Milwaukee and greater Milwaukee. So thank you to Boswell, and thank you to Damian for being here, and for Chad and the family of four parishes for co-sponsoring, and for all of you for being here. Damian and I are going to have some conversation around Nicholas Black Elk, and I'm going to introduce Damian again to you in a minute, but I thought I would get started by reading a few pages. I am told that a lot of people come to the book talk and they expect to have the author read a little bit. I'm not going to read for very long, but the introduction deals with 3 or 4 issues that I want to sort of get on the table right away. And one of those issues is the portion of the introduction that I'm going to read to you now. So just sit back for about 5 minutes. There is also the issue of a famous, often confusing book that has made millions of people think they understand Black Elk. I'm talking about the most popular book ever written about a Native American, Black Elk Speaks, being the life story of a holy man of the Oglala Sioux as told through John G. Neihardt, first published in 1932. Some have called it an autobiography, including Neihardt himself. But if that's the case, it is an accounting of the life of Black Elk that excludes the most important aspect of more than half his lifetime. The millions of people who have read Black Elk Speaks might never discover how he converted to Catholicism and why, and what a profound impact this had on the second half of his life. For this reason and more, 20 or so years ago, the editor of the Black Elk Reader opened his introduction with this sentence: "The more we learn about Black Elk, the more controversial he becomes." You've already seen the opening lines of this book, which I hope you now will reread more ironically. Quote, "My friend, I am going to tell you the story of my life as you wish. And if it were only the story of my life, I think I would not tell it." That's Black Elk speaking. What Black Elk, whom we know today as Nicholas Black Elk, had to tell John Neihardt was much more than the story of his own life. It was the story of his people, the Lakota Sioux and his people in the church, even though that part didn't make it in. Neihardt was the poet laureate of Nebraska in 1930 when he traveled to Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota to find Black Elk, or anyone like him. Neihardt conducted 3 weeks of interviews with his subject in the spring of 1931, suspecting that he'd have an incredible tale to tell of a living icon of the tears and epic struggle of the native peoples of the Americas. He depicted in colorful detail how Black Elk grew up on the plains as second cousin to the famous Crazy Horse. At 10, Black Elk was at the Battle of Little Bighorn and saw what happened. He then became a ghost dancer among his people. Stories of ghost dancing were at the heart of what Neihardt wanted from him. Black Elk fought among his people in many of the battles that led to the massacre at Wounded Knee. There was an exoticism to the tale Neihardt wanted to tell of what had been lost, perhaps forever. Most of all, Neihardt wanted to paint a portrait of lost spiritual and religious treasures in Native life. Lost dreams, a vision destroyed. He had an agenda, as every writer does, even those seeking a simple interview. He was writing epic poems about Native American ways, and he wanted to understand the ghost dance, what he called the Song of the Messiah. Black Elk was his opportunity to do that. Neihardt likely invented some of what his subject speaks in the famous book, but will go on quoting it anyway, supplementing it with many other sources. Why is all of this important? The black elk that Neihardt preserved is the image that remains in the popular imagination, a lost warrior, a spiritual sage of a once proud people. Scholar of Catholicism and Lakota ways, Damian Costello, who's here with us tonight, describes it as the essentialist black elk, the proud, defiant, yet vanquished warrior. That's the person Neihardt went looking for when he knocked on the front door of the Pine Ridge Agency in 1930, and as a result, that's what he found. He missed a great deal, some say intentionally so. He wrote in his original preface that black elk, quote, seemed to represent the consciousness of the Plains Indian, unquote. Such statements are dreamy, indefinable, and yet powerfully appealing to readers hungry for spiritual understanding and perhaps weary of traditional Western Christianity. And as I said, every writer has an agenda. I'm sure that I do too. Another agenda is the one portrayed by Native Americans who want to use black elk to support their causes of indigenous resistance. Most recently, in 2016, in the protests in North Dakota over a pipeline at Standing Rock. Sioux author and professor Nick Estes, for instance, blamed Neihardt for using black elk, but then also assumed that black elk became a Catholic only, quote, to protect himself and his family, unquote. This is just as common of a trope about our subject as the tale that Neihardt told of a lonely, sad Indian who had lost everything that mattered to him. The Great Depression was just beginning when Neihardt traveled to Pine Ridge. There was a crisis of meaning throughout America and the world. World War I had disillusioned Europeans. It took the Great Depression to do the same here. The American dream was suddenly seen to be a fantasy. It had crumbled. Perhaps a lost civilization provided a key. Also at work in 1930, and even more so when Neihardt's book appeared in 1932, was the sculpting of Mount Rushmore, 80 miles northwest of Pine Ridge, still in the Black Hills. Sculptor Gutzon Borglum was hard at work creating the faces of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, each the size of 10 men, on a mountain once called in Lakota the Six Grandfathers, now baptized Mount Rushmore, for the New York lawyer who donated $5,000 toward Borglum's work. The white man was imprinting his gods on the face of the mountains of the people whose land they'd recently stolen. For many, Rushmore is a monument to their pain. As Estes has put it, quote, each president, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, had participated in indigenous genocide and land theft, unquote. Most important to realize is the misunderstanding about Black Elk's life that Neihardt's book leaves behind. Millions of readers have, for decades now, been left with the impression that Black Elk Speaks offers a complete portrait. In fact, it leaves out much from Black Elk's final 4 decades, including every aspect of his Catholic family, his Catholic formation, and his life as a would-be Catholic saint. Kin to this confusion is the mistaken notion that Black Elk sat for those interviews as an old man at the end of his life, a confusion fostered by Neihardt's repeated statements at the time about Black Elk's physical blindness. The suggestion wasn't true. Black Elk lived another 19 years, and as you will soon see, he made clear statements in those 19 years about how certain people had misportrayed him and how his life was about much more. So despite the fact that Black Elk Speaks, after initially poor sales, became one of the 20th century's most important documents on Native American culture and a classic of world literature, we must realize that its author neglected to tell a vital part of Black Elk's story, his Catholicism. Neihardt the poet seemed to have assumed that the white man's religion was inessential to the true spirit of his Lakota ghost dancer. This is just one of the reasons why later editions of the book changed the cover from "as told to" "as told through" Neihardt. The book became an international sensation in the 1960s. translated into many languages. The defiance of Black Elk Speaks became most popular at precisely the time when the mighty invading US military was suffering defeat after defeat at the hands of the humble indigenous people of Vietnam. Neihardt was also a charismatic figure, and another stimulus for his book becoming a bestseller was an appearance by him at the age of 91 on the Dick Cavett Show in 1971. Cavett later wrote his memories of that day. I'm quoting Cavett. As taping went on, I could see the profound effect he was having on bystanders in the studio as he wove his tales and stories in that mesmerizing way of his, taking you back in time. He told his immortal story of Black Elk and the vision this mystic and noble American Indian had so fortunately settled upon Neihardt as the man with the skills and understanding to bring his colorful and spiritual vision to the world. The TV personality then concludes, that same post Neihardt next morning in New York City, my producer's wife found herself among about 20 people outside the big bookstore across from Carnegie Hall waiting for it to open. When it did, they all went to the yard-high stack of Black Elk Speaks the canny owner had put on display, having seen the show the night before. She bought her copy and then watched as the stack went down one by one to zero. Neihardt had come to embody that essentialist aura that he had once given to his famous subject, and a book decades old was reborn. But Robert M. Utley, a former chief historian of the National Park Service and an authority on Sitting Bull, once wrote that Neihardt, like Mari Sandoz, who authored a biography of Crazy Horse, and Stanley Vestal, who wrote on Sitting Bull, were three literary scholars of a particular generation who presented themselves inaccurately as historians, quote, in works that are good literature but bad history, unquote. We'll leave it there. Now, as I said, I wanted to introduce Damian again. I'm so grateful that Damian joined me tonight for this. I say in the acknowledgements of my book that I wish it had been written with Damian, and that was originally the plan, but he had a lot of other things he needed to attend to. And I want to tell very quickly the story of when I first met Damian. I don't know if you even remember this, Damian.
Oh, I absolutely do.
So I lived in Vermont for most of about 20 years. And we lived in Montpelier, which is a long way from the airport, which is true of just about anywhere you live in Vermont. It's a long way from the airport. And it's so long that nice people in Montpelier, and we were nice people, would put out a thing on a board. In fact, my wife did this. I didn't do it, but my wife did this, saying, we're going to the airport. Does anybody need a ride? And we would just give each other rides to the airport. And so my wife was driving me to the airport one time, and this took about an hour and a half, so it's good to share the car. And we shared the car, as it turned out, with Damian's mother-in-law, right? It was your mother-in-law, yeah. And so we're talking along the way. I'm driving and she's in the back seat, I think. And she tells me that her son-in-law and her daughter, she's really excited because her son-in-law and her daughter are about to move to Montpelier. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. And what do they do? And she ends up saying that her son-in-law is a PhD from University of Dayton. And I said, oh, in what? In theology. And I said, oh, really? Wow. I mean, I'm really perked up because I thought there aren't many people like this in Vermont, let alone in Montpelier. And I then sort of went out a bit on a limb and I said, you know what? When he comes to town, I gave her my card and I said, you should have him get in touch with me because I'd like to meet him. But also, I remember saying this, it can be kind of lonely it can be kind of lonely to live where we live and to be interested in religious things and so on, because, Vermonters aren't exactly religious folk on the whole. And I didn't used to have many people who I could talk to about the things I was passionate about. So Damian gets my card, I guess, and he does send me an email or give me a call and we have breakfast. So we're sitting at this place for breakfast in Montpelier. And I had just pitched the idea of a story to America Magazine about Black Elk, a topic that I did not know a great deal about, except that it would be a wonderful story to tell. He was a fascinating figure. And his cause for canonization had just gotten underway, which is why it really caught my attention. America Magazine was all over it. They said, oh, yes, we want you to do this story. And they even gave me a decent budget. And they said, you can fly out to South Dakota to do some interviews. It'll be a feature article. I was all excited about this. So I was reading up furiously and doing that sort of background kind of work that you do before you ever even consider starting to put pixels to paper. So that's the moment at which Damian and I are having breakfast. I, of course, did not do any homework on who Damian really was before we had breakfast. And we're sitting there over our scrambled eggs. And I say to him towards the end of breakfast, we've already talked about a whole bunch of things, our wives and our children and things like this. And I say, do you happen to know, I think I actually put it this way. I said something so stupid like, do you happen to know anything about, like, do you have any background in, Native American kind of stuff? And he says to me, well, I remember with like great humility, instead of saying to me, you idiot, he says to me, well, yeah, actually, I wrote my dissertation on that, and it became a book published by Orbis called Black Elk, Colonialism and Lakota Catholicism. And I paused for a second and I said, oh my God, that book is on my desk. I'm reading that book right now. So anyway, there's the book, there's Damian's book. And that's how I met him, and what an idiot I was when I met him. So Damian, thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I think you left out part of the story. So we were living on the res up until when we moved back, the Navajo reservation. We had been there for about 4.5 years. My wife is a physician and she worked for the Indian Health Service. And I was not ready to leave. We were from Vermont and we were coming home. But it was best for our family. And she was, bless her heart, she let me drive home our vehicle. She took the 2 kids and flew home with my mother-in-law. And I drove through Pine Ridge and I made a pilgrimage to Black Elk's grave. We had made a pilgrimage there on the way out. And I had done this work in the early 2000s, had put it aside and never knew what it meant. And so I was doing some soul searching, I was really praying there, like, what does this mean in my life? And I got back this chance meeting with Jon. And if I remember correctly, you soon after that said, you know what, Damian, we're moving to Milwaukee and I can't make this trip. What do you say you go out and make this trip? And of course, for me, I can't tell you what a blessing that was in my life. It really put me back in this work. And so this is leading into a question to you, Jon. I found in my own life that Black Elk really kind of finds you. I mean, it doesn't find everybody, but so many people that I talk to who have a connection with Black Elk, who've read Black Elk Speaks, or now they know about the cause, something speaks to them on a very deep level. And I think you have a good way of talking about that, why you wanted to write this book. Well,
I mean, I wanted to write the book because of the big stories that you get to tell when you talk about Black Elk. I mean, that's really what attracted me. I've written a bunch of books, and many of them are about medieval figures. Like Daniel mentioned when he introduced me, I wrote a book called The Pope Who Quit about Celestine V in the late 13th century. And I've written several books about Francis of Assisi and other things too. But I actually had never written a book about a 20th century figure, late 19th century, early 20th century figure. But I am so attracted to the big stories of history, the storylines like the building of the railroads and the gold rushes and the creation of the reservation system and the moving of Native peoples further and further west, and the heartache and the Trail of Tears and all the things that are part of Black Elk's life is part of what really drew me to want to tell his story. He as a person, as a figure, as a possible saint, appeals to me in more personal ways. But I mean, that's the way in which I was drawn to the story. And yes, I remember saying to you, I think I even said to you at that breakfast, right after that conversation I just recounted, will you write this article with me? I mean, like, oh my goodness, you should just write this with me. And then you immediately said, sure. And so I went back to my office and emailed America and said, I now have a co-author. Is that okay? And they said, yeah, sure, it's fine. And then you took the lead on the whole thing. And then when I was asked to write the book, I actually was asked to write this one before the biography of Father James Martin that came out exactly a year ago. So I started work on this earlier, a long time ago, 3.5 years ago.
Yeah.
But then we kind of moved ahead the James Martin project for a variety of reasons. So that one came out first. But this, and you and I were doing a little bit of back and forth on this for a while, but then you had a lot of other things to do. And one of the things I want to ask you, because I know that people who are watching will want to know, is you were a vice postulator of cause for canonization. Can you just tell us, what does that mean? What did you do, and where does the cause go from now? And before I turn over to you, I should say, Bishop Russ in the Diocese of Rapid City put forward the cause to the bishops in the U.S. and it was approved. That was in, what was that, 2016? 2017.
Yeah.
Early, right.
It was I think November of 2017. Yeah.
Oh, and it went to the USCCB.
Yes, the annual conference. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, what is it like to be a vice postulator? And how do you even get asked? I mean, do you get an email? I mean, how does that work?
It turned out being a phone call. Now it sounds really fancy, and I'll let you keep that impression if you want. But what it is, you are a public advocate for this person. You're selected for theological, archival, professional, whatever sort of knowledge you have of this person, and that you have a good way of bringing the message forward. And so the former postulator, when he came to South Dakota, and he looked through all the stuff that the diocese had gathered, all the different people they'd worked with, he came across a couple different people that he thought really sort of captured the essence of Black Elk's witness. And so I was actually very surprised to get this phone call, because I did this work 20 years ago now, and if somebody had asked me, what do you think Black Elk's a saint, I would of course said, oh, absolutely, I am convinced of that, convicted. I don't know if we're ready for that or ever will be. He's known first and foremost, at least before the cause started, as a Native American holy man. And for some Catholics, that's a big hurdle perhaps to get over. I've been very surprised that the support has been almost unanimous. I haven't heard really any opposition. So to be asked to be a vice postulator was real affirmation spiritually for my work that I had done for a long time. And it allowed me to really spread the word in church settings, to take my academic work, which maybe at the time was a little edgy, to bring it into the center of the church, because that's where it belongs. It's where the saints are.
Well, and you brought up one of the big storylines that attracted me to write about Black Elk and spend a lot of time researching Black Elk, which is what some people would call double identity, double belonging, double identity, someone who is able to hold within them more than one religious tradition or more than one identity, spiritual identity. Black Elk does that. I'm surprised you say that you haven't heard any opposition. I've already felt some opposition, just, my book coming out 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
There are those who are uncomfortable with the idea that someone could pray with the pipe, and the drum, and practice Lakota ways, but also live a sacramental life as a Catholic. And one of the things that I deal with in my book, there's a whole chapter devoted to how he confuses two communities. Catholics get confused by this, and Lakota and Native Americans get confused by this. I mean, there are those who, on the Native American side of the equation, who want to say he was only pretending. And I quoted one of those, right, in what I read from Nick Estes, saying he was really just pretending. He was making the white man happy by pretending to be a catechist for 40 years. And then on the Catholic side too, and I mean, one of the things that I don't usually hear mentioned, but for instance, Black Elk murdered a few people, right? I mean, it was in battle, but I mean, he killed the Battle of Little Bighorn. And if you do a Google search on saints who have killed people, you won't find many. I mean, there are a couple, but there are not many. I mean, for instance, I was just asking a Jesuit friend this afternoon to remind me, did Ignatius of Loyola ever admit to killing anyone in battle? And no, he didn't. Surely he did, but I mean, no, he didn't ever admit it, even though he had for brawling. So anyway, there are a whole bunch of reasons why Black Elk makes people uncomfortable. And just to finish the thought, that makes me feel better because I sometimes make people feel uncomfortable because I have kind of a variety of identities going on in my own life.
Yeah, well, I think that's where one of your gifts is really important for this topic, and that what you bring to the table, because when you actually go and read about St. Francis, for example, he's not the domesticated petter of dogs that we like to imagine him as. I mean, he did that, and he did love animals, there's no question, but he was an incredibly complex figure, complicated, contradictory in some ways, and only fits neatly in a box once you get a few centuries away from him and don't actually read the material about his life. I don't know if you want to comment about that.
Well, no, it's true. I mean, I've written a bunch of books about Francis of Assisi. It's probably my primary, passion, and there's a connection. I mean, definitely, and that draws me to Black Elk too, or it helps me to understand Francis, I think, in light of Black Elk. In the books I've written on Francis, I haven't talked about what I'm about to say very much, but I do talk about it in a book that's forthcoming a little bit more. And I think that's because I was writing it while Black Elk was very much on my mind. And so it impacted how I see Francis. But, in his gentleness, I'm talking about Francis now, in his gentleness and in his reverence for creation as mother and as siblings, you see almost an indigenous kind of understanding. It seems strange to us, and it seemed even stranger to people 800 years ago that Francis talked that way. One of the things that I often say, in sort of retreat settings is that I'm amazed that Francis wasn't thought to be heretical, for the canonical of the preachers, given the medieval mindset and how radical it was. So, I mean, Francis wasn't asking people to consider what, in Zen Buddhism you might call mindfulness. He wasn't saying those who walk in gentleness walk upon holy ground, as if we make the places holy by how we walk upon them.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying the places are natively holy. And that is perfectly in tune with Black Elk and with an indigenous understanding, a spiritual understanding. So, and Francis, did all kinds of things that, again, were bizarre 800 years ago and are still strange today. He negotiated with a wolf. He would pick up worms off of the street during a rainstorm and put them back in the grass to save them. He even advised his followers to walk gently over stones. I mean, that one really gets me, to walk gently over stones, almost as if he thought that they were animate, as if the whole world was animate. So yes, Francis and his connection with Black Elk means something to me. And I think it's Black Elk that has helped me to understand some things about Francis.
Mm-hmm. And I think also helps us to, dig a little bit deeper. This is where my work is currently going, not to spend a lot of time on this, but, if you look at those sort of early generations of converts across the globe, I think probably Ireland is the example that people are most familiar with, how much of the indigenous culture permeates and just imbues the spirituality of these early holy people that very much bridge these two worlds. But that's the term that we use. It's not a word or an understanding that people like Black Elk have. It's sort of an artificial system, dualistic system that's pushed onto them that makes them be seen that way. But you could speak about this about Black Elk. He's very much comfortable in sort of a singular world a whole spiritual world that outsiders like us or natives today who don't have the benefit of their entire tradition or growing up in a Christian tradition as well, see as separate and antagonistic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to me to consider, with this richness of the Native American understanding and with the Lakota spirituality that Black Elk had long before he met his first missionary.
Mhm.
It is interesting to consider his conversion to Catholicism.
Yeah.
Easy to see why that is really hard for some people to accept and to understand. You know, I mean, I remember in the book a couple of times I quote Christopher Columbus
Mhm.
and horrible things that he wrote in his journal, you know, in 1492 and in the years around 1492. And one of them is something that goes like, he's writing back home and he says something, you know, he's met some indigenous people on the continent. And he says they should be good servants because I've observed that they repeat really easily and quickly everything that's said to them. Which, you know, given that kind of prejudice and that kind of assumption is what drove missionary activity, so much of it. Right? It didn't so much drive Jesuit activity, thank God, which put the black robes, which they were called by the Lakota, into better stead than some other missionaries. But that whole system of colonialism and exploitation and broken promises, and then still conversion of Black Elk to Christianity. And of course, he wasn't the only one. There were some other prominent Lakota and Native people who converted. But it all makes it very convoluted and very interesting.
So maybe that's something to describe, because you do a very good job of that. Why did these missionaries even show up? I mean, the Jesuits were there before the government, but the whole reservation system was built on churches enforcing government policy.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I have the answer to that, but I mean, you look at it, you know, tragically and geographically, really, don't you? I mean, I don't know the dates off the top of my head too well, but we're looking at about 1810, 1820, and what was called the Northwest Territory, which was the Upper Midwest, was you know, Indian land. But then the French were flowing down into it, including Marquette. For whom a lot of things in my city of Milwaukee and state of Wisconsin are named. Because he eventually then went from Michigan and came over here. But you know, you move geographically from the Upper Midwest, and then you push further and further, and then it became. What was the year when the Mississippi River became the dividing line, and it was everything west of the Mississippi land, and then of course we that promise a few years later, and then the reservation system was created. But yeah, I mean, the missionaries were an integral part of the colonial enterprise. And then to tragic consequences, which I would imagine most people have heard in some form or another, both in this country and in Canada, where we made sure that we destroyed native life. We enforced the cutting of their hair. They had to wear Western clothes, and then they had to live on parcels of land. No longer could they live in ways that we thought were wild. They had to cultivate crops. They had to, you know, they couldn't move with the buffalo herd, and so on and so on. We consciously destroyed their way of life, and then consciously we're trying to convert them at the same time. Again, all the more reason why it is fascinating to me that someone like Nicholas Black Elk would genuinely convert to Catholicism. What a challenge and how difficult that must have been, which is a good argument for the fact that a lot of conversion is a genuine work of the heart, you know, not so much work of the head.
So we did have a question here about the canonization, and I want to come back to that, but I would like you to talk about what is at the heart of his spirituality and his faith. You know, what is that sort of anchor, do you think, that allowed him to negotiate all these different tragedies, transformations, stages of life?
Well, I think at the heart, I want you to answer this too, because it's making me think a question I want to ask you. I think the heart of his faith and his vocation was what began with his great vision as a boy, carried through then throughout his life, whether he was a Lakota medicine man or a Catholic catechist. It was a continuation of the same vocation that he felt called to at the age of 9 or 10, which was to heal his people. The tools for the healing changed a little bit, or maybe not changed, expanded. The pipe and the drum and various other things. And then were added to that a 2-road catechism for teaching, and a body of scriptures that he hadn't had before, and a sacramental life. He added these other things, but at that same time, he was able to hold, pray with the pipe and pray with the rosary at the same time. But it was, I think, that vocation, that spirituality, the whole time, since he has that first vision, that great vision, is to heal his people, and continually trying to find what's the way to heal his people. And eventually, you and I need to come back to the fact that he then traveled abroad with wild dogs.
Yeah.
Fascinating. But I want you to answer this too, because one of the things that you do in your book, which I already held up, I should hold it up again, which I don't do in Nicholas Black Elk so much, because I was very restricted in sort of space and page count and so on, but also because I didn't embrace it in quite the same way as you do. But I find fascinating the way you do embrace the great vision and what it means, the sacred hoop, the flowering tree. Can you, in 2 minutes, kind of weave that through? You're probably good at that.
So 9 years old, Black Elk gets sick, and you describe it sort of as a near-death experience, which I think would be accurate the way we would describe it. But he's unconscious for 12 days, and he remembers being taken up into the sky, into the spirit world, where the 6 grandfathers have him lead his people down the black road of difficulty and the red road, the good red road, where at the center of the sacred hoop is a flowering tree where all of his people and all the peoples of the world are renewed. There's this great line where he jokes, he says, I saw all these different people, all of them. I wasn't sure if I saw white people though, but I did. They were there too. And so they're told that he's given the power to heal and the power to destroy. He's going to save his people. All this stuff is going on. 12 days, all kinds of imagery. It's beautiful. You have to go check it out. And I think what you're alluding to is that, if you read the scripture in depth, what he was known to really sort of key in himself, you see all the imagery of the book of Revelation and then a number of the books of the prophets, Zechariah in particular, and the book of Daniel. A lot of similarity. So in that book 20 years ago, I said, well, you know what? If you look at it, it's almost as if he's telling the story of salvation history with the tree as a Christ figure, the cross. We can talk about this all night. I'm not as strong in that as I was in the past, as you'll find in my book. But I think the long and short of it is that this was something he spent his whole life trying to discern. One of the most beautiful things about Lakota tradition and a lot of Native traditions is the centrality of the vision in how, what your life becomes. Your callings are given in visions. And some of them, a lot of them are just to be a traditional healer. Some of them are given for war, strength in war, but some are also given to give new ceremonies to the people so that they be renewed. And so the sun dance, which is known as one of the most important ceremonies in all of Indian country now, it's all over the place, even in Atlantic Canada and places where there was no sun dance, that was given in a vision. And so when you read Black Elk's vision, there's all this universal overtones where he knows he's being called to something bigger than just healing on a one-to-one basis. He knows he has to do that too, but he spends his whole life discerning that. And so I think that flowered in the ghost dance and then in his Catholicism as well. But I think his Wild West years in Europe are really important for the story if you want to jump into that.
it's one of those fascinating storylines that we hadn't mentioned yet. I wanted to make sure we did mention it. And again, I find it interesting that he would do it. He wasn't the first Lakota to join Wild Bill Cody, but Wild Bill Cody created his Wild West show, caricaturing Native American life. And Black Elk would dance, so he'd get paid to dress up and to dance as a Lakota at the same time that he knew that his Lakota life was being destroyed by the white people he was dancing for. They traveled all over the United States, spent weeks at Madison Square Garden, got on a ship for 6 days, went across the Atlantic to England. Black Elk danced for Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria actually bowed to Black Elk, which Black Elk was delighted had happened, because all that the native folks had seen was people bowing to the Queen, and instead she bowed to them. And then she asked for another performance, so she got a second performance. And then he got lost a little bit and he got arrested in a bar, and seems like he might have had a girlfriend for a while when they made a quick trip to Paris. Fascinating. And then he ends up coming back. He comes back right at the time when the ghost dance has begun, right? And then a year later, you have the massacre at Wounded Knee. So, I mean, there's no wonder that there's been a lot of Hollywood movies made about this kind of stuff, and there's been some novels about this stuff, because it really is. These are great stories. But he's a fascinating figure. And again, the impetus for my book was that the cause for canonization has gotten started. You didn't answer what I asked you before, which is basically just to sort of prod and say, really, no Catholics have challenged this to you? Is that right?
I haven't, to be honest with you. I haven't even really seen it online much, and you can find anything. I mean, I guess I could dig deeper. But my experience is, when I've brought this message to people and they hear it in its totality, they're generally moved by it across the spectrum. And I think that's one thing that I think Black Elk has a sort of unique characteristic. Like, he has this ability to let you see the world in his eyes, through his eyes. He wasn't the greatest warrior. He wasn't the richest guy. He was, of course, very spiritual, but his greatest characteristic, I think, was that you could see the world with empathy through what he experienced.
Yeah.
And I think people believe that. There's a real authenticity to his voice. That's been my experience. I mean, maybe they'll come after me now, but.
Well, one of the things I love about him, there's some Black Elk sayings that I love. And one of the simple ones is that as a catechist, he would often say, when people would ask difficult questions, he would say, "It's a mystery."
It always works.
Well, I mean, for me, I would use it because it always works, and I don't have to try to figure out how to answer a question. But for him, I think it's because, for him, faith, God, holiness was mystery. I mean, it really, that was a satisfactory answer, and that was a truthful answer. But what an interesting answer from a catechist, right?
Yeah. And somebody who has a real believable encounter with mystery, I think. I should circle back on, maybe you asked this, is there been any pushback? And this gets back to, I think you asked about where the cause is. And there was one question about what Basil Braveheart, who's a prominent Lakota spiritual leader now in his 80s, but what Lakota people think about it. Now, I don't want to pretend like I can speak for Lakota people. I can just give you a sense of what voices I've heard. I think at first there was some suspicion that, Native peoples were left with not a lot coming out of this process. Now, particularly when you go to Pine Ridge, a lot has been taken away or beaten up. And there was, I think, some people who felt, are you going to take this from us too? Really?
Yeah.
And that was not a universal sense. I think that was a segment of the population. I have heard from people though on the ground who feel like that the other side of the spectrum that saw this as a great honor, one of the highest honors you can pay to a human being, that would be good for him to have received it, that has grown. I think there's some trust that's been built. And I think the way the Jesuits in particular have gone about it has been impressive. They have a working group where it's formed of Lakota elders, Lakota Catholics, but also some non-Catholics, some medicine people to say, hey, is this okay what we're saying about him?
That's good. What
should we change about how we're talking about him? There's a real dialogue going on. Now that won't convince everyone, but I think, at least in my experience, I can say it's going forward, I think, in an honest way, and hopefully it'll continue. So where we are now, he is servant of God, so it's completed the local phase, all the local research. It's been approved by the USCCB, and now it's gone to Rome, where there's a Roman postulator, and he is bringing that to the Congregation for Causes for Canonization, I think is what it's called. But we got slowed down by COVID like everyone else. We're hopeful we could hear something this summer. Just waiting for prayers.
Yeah.
And I will say I've had a couple personal conversations with people who have believable miracle accounts. I don't know if they'll be ratified in the proper way, but that's very edifying. There is a real spirit, I think, of the cause being embraced as a meaningful witness for where we are now, a different way of speaking to the world in a spiritual way.
Well, and we don't have a lot of time left, but let's keep talking for a few minutes, sort of Catholic inside baseball, just for a minute, because
Sure.
I know there are a bunch of Catholics who are on this call. Not all, of course, are Catholic, but let's stick with it for a minute, because the cause for canonization, as you know as well as I do, can take centuries, let alone decades and so on. It can take millennia, and it may never happen. But this Pope is exactly the Pope who understands Black Elk. When you read Laudato Si, which, by the way, is another bridge between Francis of Assisi and indigenous understanding. When you look at what happened at the Synod on the Amazon, when you acknowledge, which most Catholics will, that there's a slow and necessary transition going on from a European-centric church to a church that's centered around the culture and the ethos of the Southern Hemisphere and of indigenous people. I mean, this is the time. This is the time for Catholics to begin to understand Nicholas Black Elk and to embrace these things. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I very much agree, and I think this is a historical moment in the history of the church. We don't have a lot of time to talk about big things, but very early in the church, we had this debate: what do we do with philosophy? What do we do with pagan knowledge? Right? We didn't know what we were going to do with the Greeks, and after a long battle, the church decided, asked the question: what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? The answer was everything. We took that wisdom, we absorbed it, and we ended up with a fuller understanding of the Trinity. Now, what we didn't do, we didn't look backwards. We didn't look backwards in the sense to the way our ancestors lived and take indigenous philosophies on their own terms and with the same sort of respect. We have that opportunity now. Yes. And that's what can happen through people like Black Elk, but other ways as well, to really take this knowledge into the church and let it infuse our spirituality. Because I think, I think a lot of us feel that deficit, that lack of connection to all the species around us, to the land we live in, that alienation.
Well put. I'm just looking at the chat. Judith Miller is asking us a question about dual belonging, and Stephen Charleston. I am not familiar with Choctaw Stephen Charleston. Are you?
Yes, I am. In fact, I'm teaching that book right now on the course. And Stephen Charleston is a great voice for sort of parsing this out. You know, for a long time, we've had a hard time taking Christian spirituality and theology, indigenous wisdom and life ways, and seeing how they can work together. I would say Stephen Charleston's The Four Vision Quests of Jesus is very much a popular articulation of the spirituality that Black Elk lived, looking at the life of Christ through indigenous traditions. Very beautiful.
Wonderful, wonderful. And then Bruce Story, who used to live 2 blocks down from me in Montpelier, is saying hello to both of us, which is nice.
Bruce, the house across the street from ours is where Bruce and Connie lived. It is still Bruce and Connie's house to our children.
They now live in Texas.
Yes.
All right. Well, hello, Bruce. I wish we could have another cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Any concluding thoughts? What's next for you? You're not the vice postulator anymore, right? Because it has gone to Rome.
Because it's gone to a next phase. You know, but this is my life. I've done it for 20 years. I think once Black Elk gets a hold of you, he sort of adopts you, you might say. But I really want to continue exploring how we can re-indigenize. I think that's something that we talk a lot about, or different circles to think about. You know, 99.9% of our, you know, put all the nines you want in that number of our genetic history is living in a way similar to Black Elk lived, or the Anishinaabe people in, you know, the region that you are, the Celtic people. We've lost those things.
Yes.
That's something that we need for our spiritual health, let alone our physical and emotional well-being.
And another quote that I love from Black Elk that I'll leave people with, and you need to ponder this in a time of meditation, and I'm serious. Anywhere is the center of the world. Anywhere is the center of the world, said Black Elk. Well, we should let Daniel come back in. I think Daniel needs to come back in because he sort of brings things to a close.
And can I just answer a quick question? Somebody asked, what is the relation of the Sixth Grandfather book to Black Elk Speaks? That's the actual transcripts. So if you want to get the words that Black Elk speaks as close as you can to them, get that book. It'll sort of get behind the dramatic narrative that Nyhart put together, which is very beautiful, but get a truer sense of what he has to say.
Yes, thank you.
Do you have any other concluding remarks, Mr. Sweeney?
My concluding remarks would be thank you to everyone for coming, and I am delighted that you all are interested in Nicholas Black Elk. I think he's endlessly fascinating and important for us, whether you are Catholic or Indigenous or on any spiritual path. So I hope you will discover him.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to Damian Costello. Thanks always to Jon Sweeney, and thanks all of you for coming to this event. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. Hope to see you at another event. And thank you again to the family of 4 parishes for helping promote the event. And have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Daniel.